Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you this evening on the subject of Dominican women in Galway. It's a real honour to be a part of this important series of talks to mark 800 years of Dominican life in Ireland. And it's even more special for me to deliver this presentation here in the Claddagh Church, a site of such significance to Dominican heritage in Galway. I'd like to begin by thanking Sister Joan Shanahan for the invitation to present to you here this evening, and to all of those who have helped to organise the seminar series and this evening's event. A special word of thanks also goes to Ultan Lally for all of his support and help in getting some of the images together that I'll be discussing here this evening. Thanks to those of you joining us here in the Claddagh Church, and also to those of you joining us online for your interest in the subject of this evening's presentation. And I want to begin my presentation this evening by situating the history of Dominican women in Galway within the broader context of women's history more generally, and in particular within the context of the history of women religious, or the history of nuns, which has in fact become a very vibrant and rich field of historical scholarship in recent years. And I suppose a huge impetus behind that remarkable flowering of studies in the history of nuns has been the establishment of the History of Women Religious of Britain and Ireland network, which celebrated its 21st birthday last year. And this is an international research network that is dedicated to promoting research on the history of women religious and nuns in Ireland and Britain from the earliest times down to the present day. Now, the network holds an annual conference, which was actually held in the University of Galway in 2018. And for those of you who are interested in the subject of women religious more broadly, I would very much encourage you to join the network's listserv, where you can keep up to date with the latest research on the history of nuns in Britain and Ireland, and also find out information about events that the network organises in Britain and Ireland. So while the History of Women Religious of Britain and Ireland Research Network is dedicated to the history of nuns and sisters across a very long durée from earliest times down to the present day, my particular interest in the history of Irish nuns, including Dominican nuns in Ireland, is during the 16th and 17th centuries. And this was the subject of my recently published book, which you have, I believe, a copy of the flyer there with you this evening. And the book is entitled Irish Women in Religious Orders 1530 to 1700, Suppression, Migration and Reintegration. And I just want to draw your attention to the front cover image on the book, which is in fact a Dominican woman of Mayo rather than Galway, but we'll take it for this evening. And this is Sister Honoria Megan, who was the Dominican tertiary associated with the Priory of Burrashule in County Mayo, and who was persecuted during the Cromwellian campaigns in Ireland. And this image of Honoria Megan finds its way, it's taken from a Dominican convent in Taormina in Sicily, where Honoria Megan is depicted among a pantheon of 12 other Dominican female saints and martyrs. And I suppose it just shows how the story of this Dominican nun on the rural outskirts of Ireland kind of finds her way into the pantheon of notable Dominican martyrs and saints in the 17th century. So my book then, it was published last year, and really what I tried to do with the book was to give the first long-term account of the activities and experiences of Irish women who were associated with or who joined religious orders from the closure of the monasteries under the reign of King Henry VIII in the 1530s and 40s down to the end of the 17th century. And really, while up to that point we had maybe smaller discrete studies of individual orders or individual women, there had been kind of no comprehensive treatment of the subject of women religious across that long period, as I say, between the 1530s down to the end of the 17th century. Now, this era in Irish history was, of course, one of tumultuous upheaval on the island of Ireland. It was a time of unprecedented religious, political and social change that was punctuated by rebellions, plantations and frequent and violent warfare. So we had major aristocratic revolts during the second half of the 16th century, in addition to 3 major wars waged during the course of the 17th century. In addition, this period witnessed the dispersal of thousands of Irish women and men, lay and religious, to continental Europe. And some of the key research questions that I wanted to answer in the book were: how did women religious negotiate their survival in the aftermath of the Henrician dissolution campaigns of the 1530s and 40s? What roles did women religious play in sustaining Catholicism in post-Reformation Ireland, and later in the perpetuation of European counter-Reformation devotion down to the end of the 17th century? What were the numbers, modes of migration and destinations of Irish women who travelled to the continent in pursuit of a formal religious vocation? And what was the nature of the familial and patronage networks that facilitated their migration? And the book really was organised then into 3 parts, reflecting the subtitle Suppression, Migration and Reintegration. And part 1, Suppression and Survival, considers the impact of the dissolution of the monasteries on the lives of those female religious who lived through it, and examines where possible their survival in the years and decades following the closure of the monasteries. And in this I argue that the impact of the closures on nuns was more pronounced than on their male counterparts, and that gender is an important category of analysis for our understanding of the dissolution process and its long-term repercussions in early modern Ireland. Unlike male religious, many of whom were later appointed to positions within the hierarchy of the Tudor state church, female religious in Ireland, as in England and other parts of Europe, were deprived of their communities and left without any option for a formal vocational life. That possibility would not reappear for almost a century later. Part 2 then, migration, moves beyond the Irish context to incorporate a continental European perspective, tracing the numbers, modes of migration and destinations of Irish women who during the early decades of the 17th century travelled to places such as France, Spain, Portugal and the Spanish Netherlands with the intention of becoming professed nuns. And this part of the book includes a dedicated chapter on the Irish Dominican convent of Nossa Senhora do Bom Sucesso, which Sister Joan mentioned was founded in Lisbon, in Portugal, in 1639. And by focusing on female religious migration, the book offers a counterpoint to early modern Irish émigré history, which has up to now concentrated predominantly on male migrants. Part 3, Reintegration, investigates the revitalisation of religious vocational life for women in Ireland during the 17th century, beginning with the establishment in 1629 of a Poor Clare convent at Merchants Quay in Dublin. This was the first official female religious foundation established on the island since the Henrician dissolutions of a century earlier. The establishment of the Dublin House was a starting point for the development of an extensive network of female religious communities across Ireland during the 1630s and 40s, with the Poor Clare order being the most prolific of the religious orders in terms of numbers of female communities, although there were, of course, Dominican, Augustinian and Carmelite foundations as well. The development, however, of the 1630s and 40s was drastically halted with the onset of the Cromwellian campaigns. Now, I will delve into more detail about the Dominican community in Galway in the 17th century in a moment. But before I do, I really want to acknowledge the debt of gratitude that I owe as a historian to 3 Dominican authors and sisters, without whom my book would not have been possible. And they are Sister Mary O'Byrne, Congregation Archivist for the Dominican Sisters, the late Sister and Dr. Margaret McCurtain, and the late Sister Rose O'Neill. Now, Sister Mary O'Byrne has been a tremendous supporter of my work for many years and warmly welcomed me to Bon Sucesso in Lisbon during a research visit there in September 2016. And although she can't be here with us to participate in this evening's proceedings, I believe she is listening online. So hello, Sister Mary. And I want to thank her for all she has done really to assist me with my work and as I say, for granting me access to the archives in Lisbon. Margaret McCurtain's tremendous influence on Irish women's history cannot be overstated, and in particular her study of the Irish Dominican friar and diplomat Daniel O'Daly was of huge importance in situating my work on the Irish Dominican convent of Bon Sucesso within its European context. McCurtain's study of O'Daly was the subject of her doctoral thesis, and it was published in 2017. Dominic O'Daly was founder of Bon Sucesso, and as Margaret demonstrated in her pioneering study of his life and times, he was a hugely influential figure operating at the highest levels of European diplomacy. Sister Rose O'Neill's very important book, A Rich Inheritance, Galway Dominican Nuns 1644 to 1994, traces the history of Galway Dominican sisters from their first arrival in Ireland in 1644 down to the 20th century. And it has been of immense importance to my own work on female religious communities in Ireland in the 17th century. So now then, to move to Dominican women in Galway. In 1645, in the midst of the bitter Confederate wars waged between 1642 and 1649, the Italian Archbishop of Fermo, Giambattista Rinuccini, arrived in Ireland. Appointed papal nuncio to the Catholic Confederation by Pope Innocent X, Rinuccini's mission aimed to restore the full and public exercise of the Catholic religion in Ireland. Thus, the Italian churchman's 4-year sojourn in Ireland encompassed a visitation of several recently established religious foundations, among them a foundation of Dominican nuns in Galway. A record of his visit to the Galway nuns in September 1647 reveals the Italian nuncio's glowing praise for the manner of religious life observed by the sisters. The community, he explained, had been living together conventually for the last 3 years, quote, under the sweet yoke of religion and in the observance of the rule of the Sisters of St. Dominic. Their confessor at the time was one Father Gregory French, whose piety and zealous interest in the welfare of the nuns was commended by Rinuccini. In recognition of the uncertain environment in which the community were operating, the nuncio conferred apostolic protection on the sisters, lest by rash attempts of the malevolent they should be drawn away from their holy purpose, or the strength of holy religion be weakened. Shortly after his visit and reflecting his papal mission, Rinuccini wrote to the Dominican nuns, requesting that they set aside a special day of prayer each month for the success of the Catholic army and the extirpation of heresy in our land. This practice, I am told on good authority by Ultan Lally, was continued by the nuns down to the 20th century. That an Italian churchman at the heart of the Roman Catholic administration was so effusive in his praise of the fledgling Galway community is significant. Situated on the western periphery of Europe, the ability of this small, recently established community to attract such fulsome praise speaks volumes about the dedicated and rigorous religious way of life that they observed. The community in question resided at the Convent of Jesus and Mary on New Tower Street, present-day St. Augustine Street, in the centre of Galway City. The foundation of this house in Galway marked an important watershed in the history of women religious in Ireland, since it was the first female branch of the Order of St. Dominic to be established on the island. Whereas the male Dominicans had a presence in Ireland since 1224, there was no medieval houses of Dominican nuns. The provincial chapter of the Irish Dominicans meeting at Kilkenny in 1643 granted approval for the establishment of the new convent, while the chapter of the order meeting at Rome a year later in 1644 officially confirmed the new foundation. According to stipulations agreed at the general chapter, the community was not to exceed 20 nuns and was placed under the jurisdiction of the Irish Dominican Provincial, then Father Terence Albert O'Brien, Bishop of Emly. So what do we know about the membership of this fledgling foundation? Well, two of its earliest members were Mary Lynch and Julian Nolan, both Galway natives, with links to the wealthy tribes of Galway. Mary Lynch was the daughter of one Andrew Lynch and his wife Anne Joyce, and she was clothed on the 6th of August 1644 and professed on the 13th of August 1645. Sister Julian Nolan was the daughter of Galway citizens Peter Nolan and his wife Elizabeth Lynch. Nolan married a distant relative, but shortly after, although the couple were said to have been happily married and quite wealthy, they separated by mutual consent and both subsequently joined the Dominican order. Julian entered the novitiate of the Galway Dominican convent on the 6th of August 1646 and made her profession on the 19th of March 1647. Thus, both Mary Lynch and Julian Nolan would have been present when Rinuccini made his visit to the convent in September 1647. 5 years later, however, by 1652, the community numbered 14 members, among them Mary Blake, Mary French and Mary O'Halloran, all Galway natives. But the onset of the Cromwellian campaigns in Ireland in 1649 were to have devastating consequences for the Catholic population as a whole, and communities of nuns in particular. Beginning with the seizure of Drogheda in County Louth in September 1649, and culminating with the capitulation of Galway in May 1652, the period witnessed the military conquest of Ireland by parliamentarian forces, and brought to an end the preeminence of the Catholic Confederate state. The campaigns resulted in a calamitous loss of life and destruction of much of the island's economy and infrastructure. In the 4 years following the arrival of the parliamentarian army, a combination of warfare, famine and disease meant that the island underwent a demographic catastrophe. Micheál Ó Siochrú estimates that mortality rates in Ireland during the period were in the region of 20%, compared to an estimated 3% population loss in England during the civil wars of the 1640s. The subsequent land settlement in 1652 resulted in a revolution in landholding among Catholic propertied classes, who confronted mass confiscation of their estates and large-scale transportation to the west of Ireland and in some cases the West Indies. The Cromwellian military campaigns and associated land confiscations were to have major long-term repercussions for the operation of the Catholic Church and its personnel. The publication of the Banishment Act of January 1653 ordered the immediate expulsion from Ireland of all, quote, Jesuits, seminary priests and persons in popish orders. Those found to be in contravention of the decree were to be sentenced to death. Female religious were included within this wider expulsion campaign, since the act was promptly followed by an additional directive, quote, commanding all nuns, whatsoever condition, to marry or quit the kingdom. A large-scale exodus of Irish clergy and religious to Catholic Europe ensued. Spain was a particularly attractive destination, since King Philip IV offered generous financial assistance to Irish religious migrants. The majority of nuns that left Ireland after 1653 did so aboard ships bound for Spain. Under arrangements brokered by the Irish Dominican friar Gregory French, 14 Irish Dominican sisters were accepted into convents across the Spanish country. They included Sisters Mary Lynch and Julian Nolan, first cousins and natives of Galway, who were received into the convent of the Incarnation in Bilbao, one on Spain's northeastern coast, and obtained a grant of 4,000 reals from the King of Spain for payment of their dowries. Now, despite the successful admission of Irish sisters to Spanish convents, integration or even acculturation in these Spanish foundations was not always straightforward. Language undoubtedly proved a major barrier to integration for Irish women forced abroad. However, linguistic barriers were clearly surmountable, and some migrant nuns attained high levels of linguistic proficiency. This was true in the case of Sister Mary O'Halloran, for example, a member of the Galway Dominicans, who joined the convent of the Blessed Virgin Mary at some. She had a more accurate acquaintance with the Spanish tongue than the Spanish themselves. Her linguistic capabilities meant that Sister O'Halloran seemed to exercise considerable powers of persuasion among her community. According to O'Hine, on one occasion, the convent confessor sought her intervention in the election of a new prioress, owing to his belief that, quote, this Irish woman could bring all the nuns to her own views. The environment of Catholic advancement initiated following the 1685 accession of James II to the throne prompted the return to Ireland of some nuns who had been living in exile on the continent. In 1686, at the invitation of John Brown, provincial of the Irish Dominican province, Sister Julian Nolan and Mary Lynch returned to Ireland with a view to re-establishing a Dominican monastery in Galway. By then, in her late 70s, Sister Julian and Sister Mary Lynch boarded a vessel in Bilbao in November 1686. 8 days later, they arrived in Galway, where they were received with great joy. Sir John Curwen, Galway's first Catholic mayor for 30 years, gave the sisters his home, a large stone house in the city centre, built in the Jacobean style with a courtyard. And among the possessions that the two nuns carried with them from Spain was the elaborate chalice veil, initialed BK or Bridget Curwen, and dated to 1683. And this veil is actually part of the Galway City Museum collection. I don't have an image of it here with me today, but it's a very elaborate chalice veil that was made by Bridget Curwen while she was living in exile in Spain. And as I say, we believe that this was one of the items that Sister Julian Nolan and Sister Mary Lynch carried back with them to Ireland when they returned to Ireland in the 1680s. Sister Julian was appointed prioress and Sister Mary was sub-prioress, and they immediately established their community in Galway City. In May 1688, their first novice, Agnes Brown, was professed, and you can see a copy of the profession record of Agnes Brown, and this is taken from the profession book of the Galway Dominicans held in the Taylor's Hill archive, and you can see it's dated the 7th of May 1688, so she's the first sister to rejoin the Dominicans upon their re-establishment in Galway in the 1680s, and you can see her religious name there given as Agnes of St. John the Evangelist. Now, under the leadership of Prioress Nolan, the fledgling community expanded, admitting several new novices who were educated with the utmost care in the greatest piety. Strict adherence to religious observance was maintained. Thus, according to O'Hine, the divine office was exactly fulfilled in this little convent, as if it had been erected for years. Despite the climate of mounting hostility towards Catholics in the wake of the Treaty of Limerick in 1691, Sister Julian's community continued to function under strict enclosure, receiving 14 girls to the habit, until the 1st of May 1698, when legislation dispersing religious communities came into force. When her convent was seized, Sister Julian feared that the sisters, all of whom were clothed in secular dress, would scatter throughout the city. However, although deprived of their habit, the nuns were buoyed by their prioress's resoluteness and adapted to life as a clandestine community. While the sisters were not bound to leave Ireland under the terms of the 1697 Banishment Act, Sister Julian did consider relocating her community, this time to France, but she was dissuaded from doing so by O'Hine. She died in late 1701 and was interred in the Dominican cemetery beside us here in the Claddagh Church in Galway. In January 1702, she was succeeded as prioress by her companion, Sister Mary Lynch. Now, I would like to just draw my remarks here this evening to a conclusion by just offering some brief comments relating to the rich literary culture of the Dominican nuns in Galway. And the Dominican Convent Library collection, which comprises more than 2,000 volumes accumulated over 5 centuries, was recently donated to the University of Galway Library. And this collection of Dominican books, which has since been catalogued, is chronologically, linguistically and thematically diverse and contains a range of literary, devotional, liturgical, biographical and historical works. The collection is a very significant one, being the oldest continuously used library in Galway City today. It holds a selection of 17th century rare books, some of which carry a number of inscriptions which point to the book's ownership, acquisition and use over time. One such book is the 1699 English translation of The Practice of Christian Perfection, a 3-part tome of spiritual instruction written by the Spanish Jesuit Alonso Rodriguez. Originally published at Seville in 1609, Rodriguez's text was to have a formative influence on Catholic devotional practice and was widely disseminated throughout Europe. 12 editions in Spanish and more than 60 editions in French, Italian, Latin and English were produced during the 17th century. At least 6 distinct signatures, all in 18th century cursive hand, are discernible and appear at various junctures throughout the book. 3 of those signatures are by men, John French, Dominic Lynch and Peter Lamar, and 3 are by women, Bridget Kerwin, Marguerite and Honora. The surname in those cases is illegible. With the exception of Bridget Kerwin, each of the signatories' names appears just once. And Bridget Kerwin, whose name, as I say, appears at least 3 times throughout the book, includes, beside one of her inscriptions, the date August the 10th, 1714. And it's possible that the same Bridget Kerwin that inscribed her name on the Rodriguez book was the same Bridget Kerwin who entered the Galway Dominican convent in the early 1710s, and a copy of her profession record is on the second image that you have there in your handout. Sister Bridget Kerwin was professed on the 15th of August 1712, taking the religious name as of Sister Bridget of St. Antoninus. The profession book of the Galway convent records that her profession was made in the convent of Jesus Maria Joseph of Galway of the Order of Preachers, in the hands of Mother Bridget Lynch, prioress of the said convent, in place of the Very Reverend Friar Master General Anthony Cloch, Master General of the Order of Preachers. Sister Bridget Kerwin rose up the ranks of the community in Galway, and in June 1728 she was elected prioress. She was evidently still alive when sometime before July 1756 the Dominican priest Thomas Burke visited the Galway nuns. Burke, originally from Dublin but with family links to Galway, had recently returned to Ireland from Rome under instructions to compose an official history of the Irish Dominican order. His sojourn in Galway was part of a wider visitation of Irish Dominican religious houses, aimed at gathering information and material for that history. In his Hibernia Dominicana, published at Kilkenny in 1762, Burke recorded that at the time of his visitation, the Galway community numbered 31 sisters, among them Sister Bridget Kerwin, who according to Burke was aged 63 years. She had been professed for 44 years and held the position of Mother Council. Kerwin died not long after Burke's visit on the 29th of July 1756 and was buried in the Dominican cemetery beside St Mary's Church here in Claddaghey. The Galway Dominican Library collection is a valuable trove which promises to open up fresh insights into questions of book ownership, acquisition and reading practices within Irish religious institutions, and especially convents, and the manner in which Irish practices conformed or not to wider European trends. Thank you very much.